lecture. Welcome, first of all, everybody, to being software engineers at Flatiron School. My name is Duke. I am a lead instructor of software engineering at the Chicago campus, which we are now all virtually at. My career in coding started off in 2014. I decided to join Dev Bootcamp as a student when they were still around in Chicago. I moved from West Michigan to Chicago. I did like a 9-week pre-work and then a 9-week on-site program. Graduated, asked them if there was any kind of trash cans that I could empty or blog posts that I could write so I could stay in Chicago. Just anything but teaching, really, because I wasn't ready for that yet. And they said, actually, we think that you might be. Would you like to junior teach? And so then I did that for 9 weeks on contract, and the contract got extended, and then I became a full-time junior teacher, and then I became a full-time teacher there. And that's kind of been what I've been doing since I graduated. I know what it feels like to go through a boot camp. I know how hard it is and how grueling it is. I'm also able to reflect on my best days and weeks of my own experience and realize that it was all internal work that I was doing and internal understanding that I was arriving at that made my best days and weeks. So I don't have a lot of illusions as your teacher or instructor that my job is to feed information into your head so much as to inspire you to go and feed yourself. I think that's what learning is. This isn't a compulsory program, right? People spend a lot of time and sacrificed a lot of opportunity, time and resources and money to be here. And so I'm trusting that everybody wants to be here. That's kind of miraculous. So we can deal with that miracle and work through it, right? So I'm just going to be trying to help people enjoy the things that they're doing. And if you find that you're not enjoying what you're doing, then we have to figure out how to bring joy back into the work, because we're all trying to improve our career prospects, not just on the money axis, but hopefully on the day-by-day feels good axis. So a few things to just start off before we even get into material. This isn't college. I would challenge everybody to put down anything that worked for them in college and try something different, just because this program is going to be a little bit different. You can definitely sweet talk me. I think I wear a lot of my personal preferences and politics on my sleeve. There's definitely a chance that I could favor you and your personal preferences. Unfortunately, I'm not the one that matters. It's Ruby as a compiler, interpreter of code. Ruby doesn't have politics. Ruby just runs stuff. My job is to help you talk to Ruby better. Later on, you're going to be in a tech interview. I'm not going to be sitting there behind you. There needs to be no parasocial thing between you and me for you to get the career that you need to have. There needs to be a lot of you working really hard, thinking a lot through vulnerable moments of feeling lost and stuck on stuff, recognizing when you've been stuck for too long for an immersive program, right? So that you don't just want to lone wolf it for 2 hours and prove to yourself that you can solve all the puzzles. A really good protocol as we work through this stuff is that if you're stuck for more than 20 minutes, you should ask for help, because we're specifically here to help you, much like you would open a textbook if you didn't understand a term in another kind of class. You should never feel sorry for quote unquote interrupting me, because that's impossible, because my job is to be here as a resource for you. Ditto for Jess, your coach. We are here to kind of help you, and so we don't want you to suffer in silence. That's one of the lecture expectations. I'm going to share my screen here so we can talk about norms of lectures. Generally, when we do these big Zoom one-to-many shaped lecture things, I'd ask to mute yourself unless you're asking a question out loud. I'd like to make sure that everybody there's one clear channel of communication, which is generally me to y'all, and then if somebody needs to ask me something to interrupt, just make sure that there's only one person doing that at a time, please. But also we have this chat, right? So even as I'm screen sharing, I can see a chat, I can type into the chat, I can say bang bang, and then that's my signal for hey, let's do thumbs up via the chat, where people tell me that they can hear me by doing bang bang back is 2 exclamation points. So see if you can find that chat window and throw a bang bang in there. When I say bang bang, I'm referring to Ruby's idiom for exclamation marks. So yeah, nice. And this is how I think the chat can play out. I'll be talking, and so as I'm going through stuff and demonstrating things, I'll try to keep things interactive and pause to ask questions to make sure that people are kind of following along too. But mostly what I'm doing is creating a video resource. I'm recording as we speak right now. On my screen share, I can go over here and I can see this is a fun little Drost effect, Hall of Mirrors deal, but I can see all sorts of fun stuff there in my screen share. So I'm recording this right now. It'll be up on YouTube. We'll be able to review it in real time or pause and rewind and stuff. So I'm trying to create a smooth video resource and not eat up a whole bunch of time stumbling around stuff. I'm trying to show you a nice, smooth way to do things. I might show you a couple of errors on purpose if I think that there's stuff that you're going to need to see and handle. But in general, as I'm working through, if a question comes up, please use this Zoom chat box to ask it. And if you notice that I'm going for a while and I haven't seemed to respond to a question in the chat box, please chat me about that too. And when all else fails, you can send me a Slack DM like, hey, when's the last time you've looked at the chat, Duke? Because sometimes I might be on a tear just talking about something that's really interesting to me, and I haven't glanced at the chat for like 60 seconds. But in general, as a question comes in on the chat, I'm going to attempt to answer it and make sure that I'll give a good answer. And then if you could let me know if my answer was sufficient, if you could say, got it, thanks, or something like that, that'll help me to kind of manage the flow from my end without having a whole lot of pauses for like that discussion cacophony that can hit us. Finally, please don't suffer in silence. If you have a question about code, that's great. I love those questions. Also, if you're having trouble like staying logged on to a call, that's a thing that happens. Or maybe like my speaker isn't coming through clearly, or my microphone isn't transmitting right or something like that. If my video or my audio is cutting out, please somebody let me know right away. If you're having issues by yourself on your end, do the best that you can to like maybe hop off the call, hop back on. I am recording it. You're never gonna like miss something forever. It will be saved somewhere. If you're having a lot of issues staying on a call, please do feel free to like just call it good for that call and then work on labs or something like that for the remaining time if Zoom isn't letting you like stay connected. If I'm ever having trouble staying fully connected on my end, then I will always make sure that we either have a makeup of the lesson or that I record the video in some other way and give you access to that material, and then we might like fold back and review that again in a later breakout. That hasn't been an issue for me yet, but I just try to keep all those contingencies in my back pocket. That's kind of like lecture Zoom etiquette. At this time, does anybody have questions about like Zoom, like what we've been using so far, getting on a call, figuring out where a Zoom link for a call is on the calendar perhaps? Other extroverts on the call, I know that felt like an eternity, but it was barely 7 seconds, and that's how long I'm going to strive to wait in between when asking a question, just to make sure that people who take time to formulate their sentences before actually just spitballing them out into the world, as I like to messily do, that more introverted people have a chance to like chime in. So we'll talk about that more tomorrow when we talk about like pairing and stuff like that too. But for today, our topic is Hashketball review, and I've got Hashketball review sitting here. I've been able to run tests on it. We're going to talk about tests. We're going to talk about enumerables in Ruby. We're going to talk about what they are, how to work with them. We're going to talk about data types. We're going to talk about looking up documentation for data types. Data types are like strings, arrays, integers, and in Ruby, they're types of objects, and we distinguish between types of objects because different types of objects can do different types of things, right? If I had a message I wanted to send, like, hey, go fly, I could send that message to a kite. I could probably not send that message to a rock, right? But maybe a rock technically flies before falling, right? So maybe a rock is distinct from a kite in some ways and similar to a kite in some other ways, or something like that. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in terms of what Ruby tells us about what a data type is and how we can interrogate that. We're going to differentiate between the following enumerables of each: map, select, and find, as well as differentiating methods based on like the kind of work they need to do as we look at the code and the job to be done from the outside in. So the idea there is, as Rubyists, we have tools for the job that some other Rubyist has put together for us. And if I just know that that tool exists and I can recognize a certain job by its general shape or pattern, then I can match the tool to the right job, and I can save a lot of my thinking for other parts of my code. I don't want to get to a place that I have to think constantly every time I want to iterate through stuff. So Ruby's given us some built-ins that are really, really nice to work with, and so we're going to play with those. We're also going to play around with a design principle called the single responsibility principle, essentially that a method should do one job and one job alone. So as we work today, if we find that a method has grown in size beyond a single responsibility, we're going to try to do some refactoring to follow this principle and keep our code in nice small bite-sized single job chunks. As we do all of this, we're going to be using Learn as our sandbox. I'm going to be literally using RSpec because from my end, like, my Learn stuff doesn't work exactly the same way that yours does as a student. Every time that you write Learn in your terminal, you're writing an alias for RSpec. RSpec is a framework and kind of a domain-specific language for writing tests for code, and we're going to talk about how we can use fail fast to test really effectively and efficiently. We're going to talk about what red-green refactor means in the context of coding, and we're going to talk about the priorities of make it work, make it right, make it fast. I think that ultimately our objective today is also to figure out like maybe a little bit of shared language about our expectations for like why we're here as students and like what our burden of proof is in terms of saying that work is good. We're going to dig deeper into like what we talk about when we say that like code is a conversation from some of the pre-work stuff. I have a very conversationalist mindset around that, but it's also a conversation with other developers. So I think the first thing that we need to do is talk about data types a little bit and be really deliberate as we do, because as programmers, the precision with which we talk about things literally is the skill with which we can work with things a lot of the time. If I don't know whether you've given me a clay pot or if you've given me a cookie, then like if you try to send me a message called bake, that could mean two totally different things. I could be preparing a food for consumption. I could be preparing a piece of pottery for reuse. Whether baking is to make a clay pot or to cook a cookie, that depends on what kind of thing is being baked. And that determines that's a data type thing. So in terminal, I'm going to clear this out with Command K on my Mac. It just clears my output so I can just have a clean screen. I'm going to type in IRB. IRB stands for Interactive Ruby. Interactive Ruby is a place that I can like write Ruby code and hit enter and run it. So if I say like puts hello, it'll puts hello, right? Notice that the return value of puts is actually nil here, but I also get to see the screen output where puts is targeted. Puts is short for standard output, like we're going to print something to standard output. So here I could also do like math operations, right? 2 minus 2 is 0. I could say 2 plus 2 is 4. We could do like 6 divided by 3 is 2. If we do 7 divided by 3 because of like integer division, we still get 2. If we want to see what's left over, that's where we use like the modulo. So 7 modulo, if we divided 7 by 3, we'd end up with some stuff, but we'd have 1 left over at the end of our division. That's what that one is for. So here's like Ruby. I can do stuff here. I can also ask this crucial question to anything I've dealt with before. Class. If I call .class on something, it tells me exactly what data type it is. So everything in Ruby that we deal with is a type of something. So 7 is a type of integer. Hello is a type of what? What's going to come out if I say hello.class? Anybody? String. Very good. Yeah, hello is going to be an instance of string here. What if I did one of these? Open close.class. Cool. What if I had brackets like this? Cool. Here's a funny one. What if I did this? So check this out. Yeah, I would be calling a class method if I called it like this, right? I'd be calling something on the array class. I like that. I think that, Joe, did you say that just now? Capital A array is a class itself. So if I say class array dot class, I'm looking at the class array. That's different between this, right? This dot class is one instance of array, right? But array is the thing that actually knows how to make instances of itself. In Ruby, like everything is technically an object. So we have this class, which is like the factory that knows how to make individual things of a certain data type. And then we have the instance of the data type itself. Don't worry, later on in the week, we're going to talk a whole lot about what it means to be an instance of something versus what it means to be a class of something. For now, I think the important thing to know is that everything in Ruby does have a class, and that when we get down to the lowest levels, we're talking about things versus like integers, strings, arrays. If I say true.class, oops, not calls. True.class is true class. False.class is probably going to be false class, right? Those are like custom things that somebody in Ruby created to embody the concepts of truthiness and falsiness. So data types in Ruby are really crucial to us because there's certain things that I can do to certain data types that I can't do to other data types. So if I say like 6 bracket 0, that gives me 0. Now, what does that mean in terms of if I said this, 6 bracket 0? That gives me an S. Now, I know enough about strings to know that a string is like a collection of individual characters. So if I thought of this string SIX as an array, then I'd have the character S, the character I, and then the character X. So it looks like I've just used bracket 0 to look up a given character in this string. Yeah, that's the I. This would be the X. I'm not sure what's happening when I do it to the integer 6. Like, what happens if I do 6 bracket 1? That's a 1. 6 bracket 2, that's a 1. 6 bracket 3, that's a 0. You know what I wonder if it's going to the binary version of 6, and showing me the binary digit at that position. Like if 6 was just expressed as a bunch of 1s and 0s, possibly. I'm not sure though. We could always check if we weren't sure. We could look up Ruby integer methods, because we know that if we called 6.class, it's an integer, right? So if I want to know how 6 behaves as an integer when I do this bracket stuff with it, I can go and find the integer documentation. rubydoc.org is a really good source for it. You're going to find various quote-unquote mirror sites that people have just copied Ruby documentation to a different like CSS style on the web page. They're all fine as long as they show you current information about how a Ruby method works. Okay, so we're here on integer. Oh, and look, we have this bracket. Now the hashtag, if I'm reading the documentation here, the hashtag next to the bracket means that I have an instance method. So I wouldn't actually call capital I integer bracket. I would have to get one instance of integer, like the actual number 6 or the number 42, and then we could look at the bracket. Yeah, sure enough, it refers to the nth bit in the binary representation of integer. The reason I guessed that was because I saw 1, then 0, and I didn't see anything other than 0s and 1s, so I kind of started thinking about binary. If your brain didn't go there, I promise you will be dreaming in code within the next 9 weeks, and I'm so sorry, and you're welcome. Cool. So this is one way that I could figure out like what is happening. If I'm looking at somebody else's code, I'm not sure why they put a bracket there. I'm not sure why they put a method. Maybe I go to the thing right before the method call and I call .class on it, and then I could look in the documentation and find that piece. That's going to be helpful for us later on. But right now I want to turn my focus to the problem at hand, because in my opinion, working through a project is the fastest way to pick up on stuff. So right now I can run rspec, which will cause me to run all of the files that are inside of the spec folder in my project. So if I wanted to like look at what's inside of the spec folder, I don't even have to travel in there. I can just ls from right where I'm at. I can see that there's a spec helper file. This is where rspec configuration gets set up. And then here's the actual tests that are driving this Hashketball lab right now. So if I run rspec, it's going to go through each of those files and run all of the tests that live in there. Now, if I'm a student and I'm thinking about like, okay, this feels like college somewhat, and therefore I'm seeing a lot of red, and in the past in compulsory education, red has meant that I'm not doing well enough, and that's going to mean that a teacher thinks that I'm bad at learning and they're going to give up on me, so I need to get away from this problem because it means that I'm no good as a coder. That's kind of fixed thinking. I would maybe talk back to that and say, okay, I've got 7 opportunities here to learn new things that I didn't understand about code, and that me as a changing and growing person, I can rise to that and be better tonight than I was this morning when I woke up. But still, solving 7 problems, regardless of mindset, that's hard. So I'd prefer to do this instead. rspec-f-f stands for rspec fail fast. And all that this does is it tells you how many tests it was able to run before it got to its first failure, and then it just shows you that first failure, right? So we have 3 passing tests here and 1 failing one. In here, how many passing tests did we have? 10 examples and 7 failures. So we still had 3 passing tests and 7 failing ones. The only difference is that when we failed fast, we only have to worry about 1 error at a time. So when we talk about red-green refactor, we're talking about starting here at 1 red failing test, and the green means let's turn the failing test into a passing test. And then refactor means let's take our code and take it from a place where it's working to a place that it can be working but also more open to maintenance, easier for another coder to read and understand, easier for ourselves to read and understand in the future, more current with like coding idioms that are elsewhere in the coding base that we're working in, a lot of ways that we can like make something better. But first we have to make it go from red to green. So now I'm curious about this first error, and I see that num points scored knows the number of points scored by each player. It expects 10 and got nil. Here is where it's easy to kind of flail around in code, but I want to prefer a process that even if I just woke up 2 minutes ago, I can follow the process and find my way home. So what I always do when I'm looking at a failing test is I try to understand where the test failed specifically, and right below the red I can see it's happening in that spec folder in Hashketball spec.rb, line 29. Since I've set up my VS Code, from within this folder I can say code and then dot. That opens up the whole directory. So not only do I have my README file that we've been in, but I've also got Hashketball and I've got the spec folder. So in Hashketball spec, it was line 29. Let's see what failed. Describe num points scored. So this is like a block in which a set of tests around this method are going to be placed. Here is one test for the method num points scored, and this one test has several expectations. It looks like there's one expectation per player on each team. 10 total expectations where we want to map the player to their number of points scored. So I've done the first piece of this Hashketball in assembling a hash, and I've done something with the players where I've turned them into arrays. Instead of just a player name pointing to a hash, I've put the player name inside of the hash as a key and value pair, and that's just going to help us do some things with iteration in a little bit that we'd like to practice more specifically today. But I've got a game hash. It's got two keys inside the hash at the top level. In terms of data type, right, game hash as a method returns one thing. If I was thinking about how Ruby thinks about this, I could think of this as 10 players. I could think of it as 2 teams. What Ruby is going to see is an opening curly brace, and then a bunch of stuff, and then a closing curly brace, and Ruby's going to go, that's one hash. So if I wanted to be very precise about naming this data type and talking about it to others, I could say this is a hash of 2 hashes representing 2 teams. We have the home and then the away. Inside of each team hash, we have a key value pair for a team name where the value is a string. We have a key colors where the value is an array of strings. And then we have a key players where the value is an array of hashes where each of those nested hashes represents an individual player's information for the game. That's a lot of nesting. That's a lot of things to keep track of. Luckily, I can just work through things kind of one step at a time as I try to debug why this test failed. So right now it expected the number of points scored for Jeff Adrian to equal 10. Why did we get nil back in return? Right? We expected 10. But we got nil. So once I know what test ran, I know that we ran num points scored, and now I can go and look at my own code's implementation of num points scored to see why 10 wasn't the return value. And this is kind of where we'll begin today in earnest with our code practice. I've got this num points scored method, right? So in my process of debugging, I'm always trying not to let the errors make me panic. I want to slow down and read them, get to the spec, right? When I'm going to write a method to make an error message go away, I'm not in the right mindset at that point, right? I can't just be trying to make an error go away. I want to think of what am I affirmatively doing with this method that I'm writing. So 2 places that I like to add stuff before I even have real code syntax, right above the method definition, and also within the method are 2 spots. So up here I want to sketch out inputs and outputs. And I'm going to say here that the input is going to be a string representing a player name. And the output should be, according to this test that just ran, right? It expected the number 10. If I look at the rest of my tests here, we're expecting 12, 24, 33. These are all integers, and they all seem to represent the number of points that player scored. If we look at Jeff Adrian's numbers, for example, Jeff Adrian, first person on the away team, did score 10 points. So we can see that kind of connection, and I can see it in my head, right? I'm not trying to trivialize any of this. I don't think this is that hard of a concept to hold on to by itself, but I'm always guarding against putting too many things on my brain at once. So as much as possible, I like to write things out and take notes for myself and make lists of things to do so that as much of my brain can be focused on the work as possible. So we're taking a string in as a name. The output should be an integer representing the player's points scored. Within the method, I believe that my task is now to write some Ruby to get the player's number of points scored based on this player name. I can know that that's my goal, and if you told me to do it as a human being, I might do something like this. Okay, so give me a player name. Let's say you gave me Jeff Adrian. What did I do? I kind of scanned through. I ignored this stuff. I ignored this stuff. I was really just looking inside of Home's players, and I looked through and didn't see it. Then I started looking inside of Away's players, and I looked through and I saw that Jeff Adrian was here. Specifically, all I need to do is look for like an orange string, but Ruby doesn't know about colors and stuff. So if I was going to be precise for Ruby, I might say that like the value at player name inside of one of these player hashes contained the thing that I was matching on. Once I found the player I was looking for, then my eye went down to that same player's points key value, and that's how I as a human arrive at the answer. I want to write that down right now, here, as pseudocode. The reason that I want pseudocode is because if I don't know how to do something without the code syntax, the worst place for me to try to learn is while I'm also trying to manage the code syntax, right? Managing the how of something and managing the what of the syntax, two completely different problems, and I can break them up. So I'd say that there's actually three problems here. We need to get... I think that if I'm looking for a player in a list of players, being able to not just have like two teams, but have like one easy list of players to manage would be a good first step for me. Get a list of players to search through. And when I say player, I'm talking about hashes. So we want to get a list of players to search through. Once we've found a list of players, I would like to find a player with matching player name. And then finally, we need to return that player's points. Does anybody have any questions about this pseudocode in general before we move on? Cool. So I think that what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about iteration, right? There's a couple of ways that we could get all of these players. I could say game hash, bracket home, bracket players, perhaps. Maybe I could say game hash, for every key in the game hash, let's get the value at that key and then get the players in that value. But now, once again, I'm kind of talking. I'm not really seeing, I'm not conversing with my code yet. Up here, I've required pry. And requiring pry gives you access to a gem. If you don't have that gem yet, you can go into your terminal and say gem install pry. Just like this. Gives you a copy of the pry gem. Pry is a debugger in Ruby. So here's what I know. When I run my RSpec to fail fast, it fails. It fails because it's running my code and it's returning nil instead of the number 10. I can make sure that it's running my code in particular by putting like a quick little P statement in here. I'll say P, yo, just to prove this. If I run my test, yeah, there it is, ... yo, and then a failure. So this would be kind of hard to like manage P statements to debug my work if my output is going to be up here, but then the actual code about the test is going to be down here, and then times 10 if I have 10 tests running at a time. Too complex. So what I can do instead, since I have pry required at the top of my file here, is within the method that I know is being run, I can call binding.pry. Binding.pry lets me have like a slowdown. Let's pause with Ruby in the context that we're in. So we're going to be within this num_point_scored method. I'm going to define a different variable out here, by the way. Cats equals felines. Cool. I'm going to go into fail fast again, and this should open up what's called a pry session. So notice a couple of things have changed. I've got this like arrow pointing at the line of code where I wrote binding.pry. Now, instead of looking at my normal terminal prompt with my computer's fun name and the folder that I'm in, I'm looking at this line number and then pry. And so pry is telling me that it is happening in the context of running RSpec right now, and that we must be inside of this Hashketball num_point_scored. Hashketball, I think, is the name of our file. Num_point_scored is a class that Ruby has generated based on the name of this method that we're in. RSpec's job is to create kind of pseudo classes to run its tests. I'm less concerned about this stuff as what happens over here. Because over here, if I type player name, I can now watch what the current value of player name is for this iteration of the method. So this time the method failed. It was because Jeff Adrian is supposed to have 10 points. Now that I'm inside the num_point_scored method, I can access the argument that was just passed in. What I can't access is a local variable that was declared outside of this method, right? As a little bit of review, that would be outside of our scope. If I say cats, we get this error, undefined local variable or method cats. That's because cats is not a method that I can call from here. It's a local variable, but it's set up outside of the method. I can't touch it. What I can touch in here is another method, though. So def game hash, that should be runnable. Game hash. Yeah, in Ruby, I'm allowed to run a method inside of another method, right? There's no rule against that as long as those methods are defined in the same scope. And now I have this like colon at the bottom of my screen. That's a signal that I've got like a read long file mode, so I can up and down arrow through this. And I can see that my my game hash is returning this giant hash that starts with home, then moves to away, and has players inside. I can hit Q to get out of that like interactive writing mode as I go. But I know that I have game hash, right? I can say game hash dot methods. If I didn't know what game hash was, first of all, I could call dot class on it. It is definitely a hash. You're also allowed in Ruby to say like dot methods. And this shows me like a list of methods, which is kind of useful, except it's like technically an array, so it's even more useful if I sort it. Now I can like really go through and browse all the things that I can do to a hash. One interesting thing you can do to a hash is this keys method, which returns an array of the hash's keys. And there's also a values method on a hash that you can call that returns all of the values in the given hash. So if my first task that lies before me in this method is to extract out just one list of all of the players so we can search through it, what I think we need to do is go through this game hash, and for each of the value sets, right? I don't really care about the word home or away, but for each of these hashes, I need to get that hash's players, and then I need to put those all into one big array. So let's see if that works. If I say game hash dot keys, that gives me home and away. If I say game hash dot values, so now check this out. I've got an array under values because it's created that when I called values, and then I've got this first hash which doesn't have a name anymore. And I wonder how many values there are. I could ask it this way: game hash dot values dot length. And I know I can call dot length because I just saw that values opened with a square bracket, therefore values was an array. If it's an array, I can call length on it. Sure enough, there's two big hashes of game hash values here. So could I get to the first one using another array method? If it's an array, I should be able to index call an index of a value and then get it. So if I call game hash values bracket 0, I end up with this hash which does contain players inside. If I called game hash dot values bracket 1, then I could get players from there. As a matter of fact, I could even chain these on bracket players. Okay, so that's a piece of it, right? I'd have that array of players, and then I'd have the other team's array of players. Here's my issue. I don't want to say bracket 0, bracket 1. I want to have a way to make sure that like we can just automatically look at all of the teams that are in here. Because what if I wanted to export this to another kind of sport that might have like 3 or even 6 teams competing at once? I know some online games work like that. Some silly versions of basketball have multiple teams as well. What could I do here to game hash dot values instead of calling bracket 0 and bracket 1? Any ideas? Yeah, concatenating them into one array. I also see looping. So as we concatenate them, right, I want to make sure that I have a chance to concatenate each thing into one big array. And to make sure I catch each thing, the second I say each to myself, Ruby is like standing there with a big blinking light for me saying like, oh yeah, each is a thing, Duke. Remember about each. So each is like an enumerable, right, that we can run on an array. If I did something like this, bracket 1, 2, 3, dot each, do number, puts number, and look what happens here. Dot each is something that you can call on an array of things, and then when you start your each loop, we use do to open up a block and end to close that block. The first thing inside of an each block needs to be a pipe variable if you would like to work with the things that you're iterating over. Basically, an each loop handles all of the under the hood for loop stuff of manually setting an index to start at 0, incrementing an index after doing something, and then starting at array bracket 0, then array bracket 1. It doesn't have to call on those things manually. We don't see any bracket calls in here. The first time the each loop runs, the value of num will be array bracket 0. And that's why we puts 1. The second time through the loop, the value of num is 2, then we puts 2. The third time through, the value is 3, we puts 3, right? If we wanted to run something like this again, we could do this each loop, but this time we do like num times num. We can refer to a value twice inside the same block, no problem, right? 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9. So an each loop will let us iterate over a collection of things, right? This is part of the puzzle. What I would like to do is kind of a quick exercise though, because I could iterate through game hash dot values dot each, and then I could say do, and I think we could call this like team info. That seems like a fair name to call it. If we iterated through each of our values, we could then like puts team info bracket players, similar to the syntax we used before. And that kind of works, right? We've got, well, wait, what actually did we get here? We have some sort of an output line. This is a return value. This is what's confusing about each. We're looking at the return value of each right here, which is just the original array that I gave it. If I hit Q and get out of this mode, though, I can scroll up beyond this, and I can see that indeed we did actually have some players that printed out all by themselves here. Team name, Brooklyn Net, oh sorry, my bad. Here it is. All of our player info is printing out here. So when we called like team info bracket players, it was smart enough to go first through the first team's 5 players. And when I call puts, it prints them out. We don't even really see the array there. My concern is that I don't want this to be the value that returns. I don't want to get back the original array that I gave it. Does anybody know of a method that can take in a hash or an array of hashes and like return out just an array of certain values from that hash? There's a Ruby enumerable that we haven't talked about yet. I'm just wondering. I see a couple of people asking about map, and I think that map is the right tool for the job here. I think that if we started with gamehash.values, yeah, good question. What do the pipes around the variable do? They let me name the thing that's inside. So if I go back to this example, every time I do one of these loops, I'm going to have an opportunity to access the actual values that I'm looping over. This just lets me name the value. I could name this x, right? And then I could say like p x plus 5, and then I'm going to get each number plus 5, right? X being the value of the number that I'm iterating through in that step. The reason that I have 3 printouts here is because there's 3 values in the first array. So X got set to 3 different values as this loop ran. The first time through, it printed out 1 plus 5 as 6. Then the second time through, the value of X was 2. So 2 plus 5 was 7. The third time through, the value of X was set to 3. You could think of each as being like kind of an automatic for loop where you don't have to define indexes or change them. So in terms of Ruby being created to give us more joy in our code, I strongly prefer each. I think that you look more like a quote-unquote real Ruby programmer when you use tools like each as opposed to a for loop. But coming back to our mantra from the end of our objectives, if all you're comfortable with today is a for loop, then I would say you've made it work one way, right? And part of making it right after that might be refactoring your own understanding so that you're comfortable using an each loop in the places where you've previously only felt comfortable using a for loop. But yeah, it's stages. So I think that .map is the enumerable that I'd like to use. I'm going to put something on the Slack for us to play with so that I don't just show everybody through map, but give a chance to create some breakout rooms and get us working with maybe map together. Feel free to use Ruby docs and talk amongst yourselves as you do this. I'm going to take this and pop it in the Slack. Actually, I'm going to uncomment it and then copy it into the Slack. And what I'd like people to do is hop onto a certain website, repl.it, which is a place that you can set up an online place to run Ruby. We can just say plus new REPL here. And then I can select Ruby as my language and click Create REPL. And then I have a spot that when I get some code from somebody else, I can paste the code in. And then I could like write some driver code down here, get names with instructor info. This is how I actually have to call it. And then if I click on run, this runs get names. It looks like there was no return value. Yep, nil came back out because the method doesn't have anything in it. But what I'd like us to do is work together to make something like this. So what I'm going to do first is pop into the Slack, and I will give you embedded code so that you can copy it into your own computer. And now the second thing I'm going to do is attempt to create some breakout rooms in here, if I'm able. Let me see if I'm allowed. I'm going to try to get everybody into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes to discuss this iteration stuff, to figure out if you can come up with a solution that uses that map method, and then we'll see if we can reapply that to our code solve right here. I'm going to make 4 rooms for us. We'll see how this goes. Oh, and hang on, right before I do this, because this is my first time ever doing breakout rooms in a mod 1, I'm going to double check that I've made Jess a co-host, because sometimes breakouts get weird. Cool, let's try this out. Go ahead and accept your invite to the breakout. Oh, I think I might. Let's try this again. Yeah, that worked. Once I had them put in the same one. Or no, yeah, now one of them is over there. Cool. That's good. How's my sound coming through? I get that a lot. Much more than I'm comfortable with. Yeah, when my Zoom craps out on me mid-afternoon, it's because I think it's because my ISP is like trying to throttle connections to like provide everybody internet at the same time. Because sometimes I have to reset my whole router to like get it all working again. Oh, sure, yeah, the give you internet stuff is the worst. My mom and I got the same smart TV, but she's staying in like a college campus that doesn't give anybody their own Ethernet and makes them sign in through some weird Wi-Fi portal. So she just legit can't use her smart TV with the internet because it doesn't have a password like through regular Wi-Fi. It has it through some pop-up browser thing that doesn't exist on the TV. Yeah. Yeah, I remember I had to spoof my computer's MAC address onto my Xbox, my original Xbox in college, to get it to be able to play Xbox Live. It's a pretty big deal. I'm glad I gave an extra 15 minutes for these week ones for expectation settings. Breakouts seem to be going. I'm going to try to give people 10 minutes because I don't feel like I need to spy on people. I made you a co-host, but I'm the host. Maybe that's why. No worries. I think it's because when it first assigned you, it assigned your 2 instances to different spots. But I think he's good now. Okay. That was even better. It's just fine. It's a little different, right? I think it's going to be okay. I'm also realizing too that if we're doing these breakouts, we still need to make sure that like we know that the lecture is recording on my end. And so, just a thing to know. It's really hard, honestly, with this video stuff, because like I feel like in order to keep a chat window going and also the Zoom stuff off of my screen, I have to move things around. Like I'm realizing just now that like my VS Code might not be showing the entire line to them, because I certainly am sometimes typing in the dark on my end, because they have there's like a chat window like half covering whatever it is I'm looking at. Little things to do. Yeah, I switched it up. I just got my ERB snippets figured out for VS Code last week, but my HTML autofills are still messed up. I wrote probably 90 manual H1 tags in the last 3 weeks. There's too many H1s. I'm tired of writing so many H1 tags. Yeah. I also love that I can broadcast and say like 5 more minutes. It's very professional, this Zoom stuff. Zoom's gonna be fine forever. I think only I can. I don't think so. I can move you from room 3 to somewhere else, but I'm not sure. So, because I did an auto-assign, I think that's why it put you in a room. But I think I can break you out to unassign somehow. Can I unassign you? Maybe not. And we can talk about like individual student strategies and check-in stuff when we're not on like a recorded lecture call. But if I have two of these, if I ever have to make 2 videos and stitch them together, or if I forget to stop recording a video and then I have to chop off like an hour of extra screen recording, I have to convert the video into MP4 using Handbrake, which takes like 20 minutes. Then I have to manually edit it in iMovie, and then I have to bounce that down, which takes another 20 minutes. So it's like it costs too much time every time. It's because OBS doesn't natively record to MP4 to save space and to help the computer run faster, as it's also screen recording, which is nice. I mean, it's really cool that I can screen share and screen record and like go through and like run a code server and all that stuff at the same time on the same machine. So yeah, during the deploy on day one stuff coming up, I will have probably more need to hop out in individual one-on-ones, because that's usually the time that people with any lingering system setup stuff need the most help. Yes. So I'm going to close all the rooms in 60 seconds. Here, I'll make you host so you can do it. Welcome back, y'all. I'm going to bring everybody else back in a minute. Yeah, Jess, so yeah, you can close down all the breakout rooms now, and that should bring everybody's zip back in here. Kind of like a Yo-Yo's power on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then, Jess, I'm going to leave you host for the next time we do a breakout, which is going to be like in another 6 minutes here. And then we'll put some more stuff together. It'll be a shorter one the next time, but I just wanted us both to get practice with it. Are all the rooms shut down now, Jess? Cool. Oh, yeah, that's right. It gives the time to copy-paste things from the chat that you needed. Nice backdrop, Sam. Now we're all firing back in. Cool, cool. So yeah, thanks for taking that time to break out. Show of bang bangs in the chat. Like, who managed to get map working for them to return the instructor names? Cool. Solid, solid. The way that I went after it was like this. See if I can find my window. Yeah, in my Replit, I ended up getting the outputs that I wanted by saying instructors.map, and then I can name however I want in here. So I said instructors.map do inst, and then I said inst bracket name. And I said inst bracket name because I knew that as we mapped over the array, each time I got to my block variable, I'd be referring to one of the things inside of the original array. So if inst is one of these hashes, I can't call like inst.name, even though this is the first syntax that I tried, because in my brain I was like, I need to know that guy's name, or that person's name. So then I'm saying like inst.name, but it says undefined method name. Sure, because a hash doesn't have a method called name on it. A hash has that bracket notation where we can access values using the key name on the hash. And so what's nice about map is that where each just does something to something in a loop, map does that thing, but then the return value of the block is also under the hood getting shoveled into an array, which map is built to return. So if I said something like return from map equals instructors.map, and then I had this method return from map dot sort, then we could use that sort that I was using before on an array in conjunction with the array that instructors.map is going to give me. Now I should get 3 sorted names. Now Derek comes first because DE comes before DU in the alphabet. So I can use the output of instructors.map in useful ways that I couldn't use the output of each, because each just returns the array that I gave it. But I didn't just want this whole array back, I wanted an array of just the strings out of it. So if we bring this back to our code and what we're trying to do in here, I feel like what we could do in terms of getting a list of players to search through is we could do the, what did we have? We had a game hash, which was our overall hash, and then we had dot values, that gave us the 2 big team hashes, and then we could do a dot map, do team info, and for each of these team infos in here, we wanted to access the players. Team info, bracket players. that should get access to the whole players array from that first team that has team info and put it into the array that map is building. And then map should go to the second team with team info and look at that team's players array and put that into the array as well. Now, as I say that to myself, I think I've just put two arrays inside of an array. So what I'm going to do is move this binding.pry down here, and I'm going to give this some sort of a variable. I'm going to say something like all players, because that's what I'm expecting this to return. Another kind of thing about knowing data types is even within a method, having some idea of input-output. So I feel like the input of map here is going to be like our original whole chunky game hash values for teams, but then our output, I'm expecting to be just the player info from those teams. No colors, no assignment of like what their team name is, right? So in here, I'm attempting to set a variable all players. I'm going to call binding.pry the next time the test fails, and I'm going to use that to inspect the value of all players that I just created. I'm in pry right now, so I have to hit exit to leave pry. Now I'm back in my terminal where I was. If I push up in my terminal, I always get the last command that I typed. I can keep pressing the up arrow, and I can go through a whole long history of things that I typed into the terminal. So as you do environment setup or like code stuff, you should always know how to like quickly redo the last thing you did. The faster I can hit up enter, the faster my feedback loop with this, right? If I'm always just looking at one failing test and one piece of code at a time, that's where I want my brain to be. So all players, let's see what this did. All players. We look at it. Now, check out this data type. How would we describe this? I see an array, so I might call it an array. But also, I see an array because of this first opening square brace, but then the next character I see is another opening square brace. So now I do think that we've got arrays nested inside of themselves. Sure enough, this first nested array ends at this character, and then the second one, this is our away team with Jeff Adrian at the top, starting right there. So I have this array of two arrays, right? If I said like all players.length, I'd hope that this would say 2, right? Because that's 2 arrays of players. I know that's what's happening right now. That's why I was hoping it would say 2, because I want my understanding to be good. My bigger hope, though, is that I can change this 2 to a 10, right? Right now I've got something like this, nested arrays. And it's something like we have one big array, and then inside of it we have players 1 through 5. Something along these lines. And then we have another array inside of it where players 6 through 10 are. So then if we say, oops, I forgot to close that correctly because my chat was obscuring the screen, so I needed another closing square brace here. So we look at nested arrays. We look at nested arrays.length. Same issue as our all players problem, right? Does anybody know a method that I could call to kind of like take this nested array and flatten it out a little bit so that it was just like numbers inside of the array? Oh, that's right. It's called flatten. I'm so silly and forgetful. Let's try this. Nested arrays dot flatten. Now check it out. That's what I want to do with my players, right? If I say all players dot flatten, now I just have one opening bracket, right? If I hit Q to get out of this output, all players.flatten.length. Oops, linked. Wait, wrong letter. Try that. Nope, my H key is busted. There we go. Cool. So we have 10 players there, and we just needed to add flatten to our map call. So we could add it here. We could say dot flatten right after where the block ends. By the way, this is technically the same as a closing square brace, and closing curly brace, and do is technically the same as an opening curly brace. But if we're ever going to do a multi-line call, it's very bad form to use literal braces. They want you to use do and end in the Ruby style guide. Furthermore, I think it's kind of weird to say end.flatten. So what I'd kind of rather do is on like a next line, say like all players, or players equals all players.flatten. That would give me a list of players that I could potentially search through, right? Now my next task would be to find the player with the matching player name attribute. We've got limited time between now and 3 o'clock. I know that that's when we're supposed to start working into the next like day 1 thing, but I want to make sure that we finish this piece of it so that we get more practice on some of these enumerables. So right now I'd like to ask, Jess, are you able to create some breakout rooms for us so that we could get into a breakout for a second snippet chunk of code just about what certain things are going to return? They can be different rooms. We can mix it up. You can let it randomly select like 4 rooms. But I've put another exercise up into the Slack, something else that you could put into a Replit and run. And in this case, it's just 3 things to run together. What I'd like you to do is play around with these, and I'd really like you to spend some time on the third one until you feel like you have a good understanding of what the third example is doing. And then we're going to come back and talk about it in about 6 or 7 minutes. Cool. I think you've done. Yes, there should be one there now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, make sure that both of Jonathan's are in the same room. 4, cool. Sure. You're awesome. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we both got a rep on day 1 so that it wasn't like a fear point for anybody. Sure. Great. Sure. I feel like Zoom's probably got so much good feedback that they could operate on, but like they're also like getting probably too much of it to be operationable or actionable. Be a heck of a team to be working on right now. Oh, you should be able to click my 3-dot menu. Try going into gallery view. That's gallery view. Nice, I see it. Thanks. I switched to the hot rod background because this is the one that I really like the most. 14 school buses. Have you ever seen this movie? It's so good. Hot rod, yeah. Guy needs to raise $50,000 doing amateur stunts so that he can get his dad heart surgery, because it's his stepdad who beats him up every day after school to try to turn him into a man, and he wants to kick his stepdad's butt really bad, but now his stepdad has a failing heart, so it wouldn't really count, so he needs to nurse him back to health so that he can beat him back to death. And that's like the whole point of the movie. It's like, I will get you better, Dad, so that I can kick your butt. It's very silly. It's got Danny McBride and Bill Hader and Andy Samberg in it, and what's her name? Isla Fisher and Will Arnett too. It's very silly. You really should check out Hot Rod. It's better than it looks. It's just really well. It's nicely paced. It's one of the movies that was like, of the 3 funny comedy movies that comes out every year, it was one of them. Sure. It's a cult classic. Also, Ian McShane and Sissy Spacek play as dad and mom. Like, it's a star-powered cast, but it's very silly. It's the Lonely Island guys are basically the producers of it. The people that made, like, I'm on a Boat and the Jack Sparrow song. It's very funny that my microphone shadow shows up on my shirt, but the microphone itself gets edited out by Zoom. So I have like a phantom mic. There it is. Oh, now you see it, now you don't. If you want to, oh wait, I'm going to do this because I forgot the rooms now. I'm going to do this. Yeah. Just going to have people put their number of exclamation points for their fist to 5 is how we've been doing it. Works pretty well. And then after that, any TILs and shoutouts. I also want to get better at bringing like the tacos back because I feel like we haven't been doing that as well as a location, and I take some responsibility for not setting the culture early, but like using the Chicago shoutouts to share the love, so to speak. Gotta give people tacos for doing good. I'm going to give it 30 more seconds, then I'll close the rooms down. We'll talk about select. I think I'm going to solve it doing select, and then later on I'll refactor back to find once we've got it working. JavaScript has a filter. Ruby has select. Maybe there is filter. No, if select is find all, I think is the alias that Ruby does for select. Ooh, like change method calls and stuff. Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Yeah, I feel like flipping the polarity on a Boolean is a bad thing to automatically refactor without like a warning in text of why you've done that, because that's the place that human minds don't usually do great at figuring it out at a glance. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Cool. That's everybody back from breakout rooms. Cool. So I'm curious, what do people think about how does select work? What is select for? Yeah. Cool. So it's doing something to every method. What's the method of checking that select is doing? Yeah, it's checking if something is true or false, or if something rather is, we could even say truthy or falsy. So real quick, if I talk about truthy or falsy, yeah, I'm talking about like things being true-ish or false-ish, right? So if I'm in here and I say like puts hello, right? Great. We could say if 2 plus 2 is the same as 4, then we will puts hello. Same output, right? If 2 plus 2 equals 5, we will puts hello. Let's level this up a little bit. We didn't print out hello that time because 2 plus 2 is not 5. This is too many lines of code for me to write every time, so I'm going to streamline it. I'm going to say puts hello. And then Ruby, you can do this if you have one condition that you want to check and one thing you want to do. Otherwise, if there's any more complexity, the one-liner is a bad move. But right now, I just want to say like puts hello if true. If true, then hello does puts. Puts hello if false, right? What if I said puts hello if empty string? Is that going to puts hello? Empty string, yeah, so if an empty string counts as a truthy value because it is a string, then we'll see puts. If empty string counts as a falsy value because nothing's in the string, then we wouldn't see the puts. But we do see the puts, right? A string is there even if there's no characters in it. Same deal for an empty array, same deal for an empty hash. What's the only falsy value other than false in Ruby? Very good. So nil is like our only false condition. Basically what select is doing under the hood is it's checking if something is nil or false like, or if it is not, in which case it would be truthy. So in my replet up here, the last thing that we do is to call array.select do number, and then we just say the number 7. 7 is a truthy thing. So right now we have an error because I undefined my array. Let's get this back and do the first 100 integers, or first 100 counting numbers rather. We have 1 through 100. They all printed out, right? Why? Because for all of the loops, 7 was still truthy. We didn't actually refer to number at all. If we said num here instead of 7, number is also going to be truthy because we're just iterating through each of those individual numbers. What if we said nil? Now we're going to make sure that everything's false, right? If everything's false, then select returns an empty array. Select only returns things in the array for which their turn in this block returns true. So if I only wanted to put 7 in the array, I could say num double equals 7, and then only the number that equals 7 should show up in my output, right? Or if I wanted to only get numbers that were evenly divisible by 0, or by 7, I could say number divided by 7 is the same as 0. There should be nothing left over if we do a modulo here. And then we'll get multiples of 7 between 1 and 100 in our output. So select, very powerful tool. Map is totally different, right? Map just does something to each thing in the source array and gives us an output array that's the same length as the source array where that thing has been done in the block. Select does something in the block, but it's to decide whether the original thing from the source array should be filtered into the output array or whether it should be canceled from ending up in the output. So select is a filter. The output array of select might be smaller than the input. The output array from map is always going to be the exact same size as the input because map always returns something to put in the output array, even if the thing that's returned is nil or false. Questions on the difference between map and select real quick? So there's select. Does anybody know about the kind of select that I would just want if I wanted to get the first result and not all of the possible matches out of an array? So we could do select, right? And then off this we could do like bracket 0. That would just give us the first thing that matched, right? And then if we had like an impossible condition again, so if it was like all nil, we'd have an empty array. The first thing from an empty array is going to be nil, right? So we could do select and put a bracket 0 on the end of this, or Ruby gives us an alias for that same thing, which is just called find. Find is select, except it only finds the first match. So I say num is the same as 200. Well, the number 200 isn't in that first array, right? So we shouldn't be able to find a number that equals 200. But if we're looking for the number 20, once we find that number, it should just kick that value out. Notice that that's not wrapped in an array like select was. Select is built to return multiple things where the Boolean is true. Find is just going to give you the first one out of the original array where the Boolean was true. So in the case of our code, coming back to this, and thank goodness I wrote pseudocode, right? Otherwise I'd be like deep in the weeds and not remembering what I was doing. But we got our whole list of players out. Then we need to find one player with a matching player name attribute. So we've got this players array. We could use .find on the players array using the logic that we just figured out. So I could say players .find, we'll say do, and then in this case I'll say player, and then we'll have, we want to find the player where the player's name, well, how do I get a player name here? How about this? What if I did a binding.pry inside the find to figure out my condition? A lot of times working with like a find or a filter is really hard because it's easy to lose track of the value that you've got. So here I'm going to get into the loop here at players.find, and we'll see what happens. Exit out of pry that time. I'll clear my screen out so I've got a blank canvas to work on. Cool. So we're in here. We had players, which was all players flat, and if we look at that one more time, That's our array of player instances. If I want to figure out like what's going to happen in here, I could look back here. We could see that we're in the find. So we have individual player that we could play with as well. Player. This is the local variable right now inside of our find loop. So how do I know if this player is the player that we're searching for? What's the other thing that I need from this method? The player name, right? This was the searched for name that came into the method as an argument. Can I look at that player name here? I can. Now, how do I get Alan Anderson out of this hash? I've got something called player that returns this hash. So therefore, the player must be the hash. If it is a data type of hash, that means I can use bracket on it to get values out. I just need to give it the key name. So I think I can say player bracket player name. And that should give me the player's name for this one. Now that's player name is Alan Anderson. I don't think they're the same. But I think when I do have them be the same, I should be okay. Check this out. When I hit exit from a binding.pry that was in a loop, I can get the next player in the list. Because since it's sitting in a loop, when I exit the first time, it goes out, comes back to the beginning of the find loop, and starts running again. So the next time find runs, we have false. Then we exit again, we're running this on the third player, right? So now we say player.player name, that's Brooke Lopez. Nah, that's not the one. Let's go here, what's the player name? Mason Plumley? Nah. Next player. Player name, Jason Terry? Nah. Next player. Player name, Jeff Adrian. Is that the same as our searched for player name? It is. So here, right now, is my Boolean logic that I can use to make my find loop work exactly the way I want it to. I want it to only return the player for which it matched the searched for name. So here, we can say player bracket player name equals player name, where this is the argument passed in on the right-hand side of the double equals, and player refers to one of the hashes inside of our array that we used, that we got map to get. So now we've used map to isolate things from the first array and get an array of the same length, but just in terms of having the players flattened out. Then, now that we have our flattened player map, we use find to pare down that list to the one player who matches. And then I think that all we need to do is return that player's points. We must remember that like this whole thing was our find call, right? This block was the argument that we passed in to players.find. If we want to set the output of this, we don't go down here and say like found equals player, right? That's not going to work for me. Couple reasons. Number one, found is the wrong scope. It's not going to get outside of this loop anyway. Number two, even if it was right, I could potentially be resetting this in ways that I'm not predicting. I just don't want to set the value here. What I need to do is set it to be here, found player, because found player is going to equal the return of all of this stuff that happens on the other side. The loop's going to happen, it's going to find a player, it's going to kick it out, and then we're ready to call it found player. At that point, I think we can just say found player bracket points. I think the player name and the player points were in the same. Let's look at our original hash. Yeah, player name and points, they're on the same, they're like siblings of each other. So if I've got access to this found player and it had a player name, I should be able to get points out of it too. Let's see if this actually works. I'm not sure, but it might. Exit again. So I'm going to say exit with an exclamation point, which is going to skip the remaining times through the loop. So exit bang is like forces it out even if you're inside of a loop for your pry. Now I'm going to fail fast again. Now check this out. Undefined method shoe size. I haven't seen this error yet, right? I've spent all this time on this method, and now I'm seeing an error about a different method. But then check this out. 5 examples, 1 failure. Up until now it said 4 examples over here. So the one thing with fail fast that's a little harder to read compared to the other RSpec output that we did at the beginning is that with this output, it's easier to see your failure count going down relative to the total number of examples. With RSpec fail fast, you only see a partial number of examples, so it's kind of up to you to be context aware. But look, we're in spec 46 now. We were stuck on line 29 of that spec file for like most of this, and now we've actually moved into a different method. Undefined method shoe size means that it's actually gone through all of these players and seen that we were correctly getting the points off of those player objects. So that first method works. Coming back to this README though, this is what we mean when we say make it work, make it right, make it fast, or red-green refactor. Red-green is the making it work step, right? Making the test go green means that your code is essentially doing the thing that it's supposed to do. Refactor is the process of making it right. Now that my code accomplishes the task at hand, is it the best it can be? Are all of my indentations on point? Are my methods broken up nicely? Am I following my design principles? Am I following the Ruby style? Have I used the right tools for the right jobs? And this is where we come back and think about this single responsibility principle. Because here is what we call a code smell in our num.points_scored method. A code smell is when code looks a certain way and you can just kind of get a whiff of it at a glance and go, no, there's something about that needs to change. And it's a sense of taste that we kind of develop over time. What I'm noticing here that my sense of taste says we need to change is, look at this. I've got an empty line here. I've got an empty line here. Technically, like, these things go together. But what I've got is 3 thoughts in one method. Right? If I didn't think of them as 3 thoughts, I wouldn't have separated them. I've clearly got this method doing 3 different jobs. This method has more than a single responsibility right now. I think number of points scored is currently concerned with knowing that game hash has values that can be mapped over to get players, which then need to be flattened. And then it's also concerned with knowing that within the player's array that there is a way to call bracket player name inside of an individual player instance and match it up with the argument that we've received. And then finally, what I would say is like the actual responsibility of this method is to return points on some found player, because it's the name of the method itself. So what I would propose is that we break up these first 2 jobs into their own distinct methods and call them by name. And what's really nice is now we have one failing test on shoe size. If it ever goes back to being about number of points scored, I know that I've broken my code, but because I'm working on a test foundation, I can freely refactor things and not be as scared of breaking stuff. I can just let my test tell me that my code still works. So without further ado, this work here can be get my players, maybe get players. Let's do that. Get players. And we'll set that variable to players. And then here I can make a method called get players. Def get players, and we'll just move the code right in here and kind of reason through it. All players equals gamehash.values.map. Gamehash is still the method that we can call from up here on line 3, so I don't think there's going to be a problem calling that method from where we've moved it. Within there, we're just going to map out and get the team info players from each team. Then we're going to flatten it from 2 teams into 10 players. At this point, my code smell here is that I'm defining a variable, which is now at the end of a method, but I don't intend to do anything else in this method. So do I really need a variable? I don't, right? I could either say return all players.flatten here, or I could even implicitly return, right? I don't have to be explicit about the return keyword. I'm at the end of a method, so I can just say all players.flatten and trust that that's going to be the return value of get players. So if players equals get players, then I need to find a given player name on that given array. So this refactor is a little bit chunkier. I'd have to move this stuff out and say something like found player equals, oh, let's do this. Let's say find player. Pretty straightforward. Let's write a method called find player. Def find player. I don't think I need the binding.pry in here anymore. Find the player. So found player equals players.find. Okay, this is going to be a problem, right? Because I don't have a value for players anymore. That actually came from my num point scored now. So I think I should pass in the array that we're searching. I'm going to pass in players because that's the array that I just created here on 136. I'm going to say here that the first argument the method takes, I can create a POV that's just for the method itself. So I'm going to call this player array. And then in here we'll say player array.find because that's what we're searching through now. Player is still a find local variable for the find block. Now here, player.playerName equals player name, that's another argument we're going to need. So I'm going to say searched name, and then I'm going to change this up to say searched name so the arguments match up. And then I will pass in player name as the second argument here. Could I have still used players and player name? Absolutely, but then I would have created a lot of confusion in people that aren't quite sure where their scopes end and start, so I prefer to just use distinct variable names for now to help everybody find exactly their place around and know where walls end and don't end. So I have to call find player with two arguments. I have to pass in the players array that I got in the previous step. I have to pass in the argument that was passed into the overall method. Now find player should be able to find the one player that equals the searched for name based on that value in the player hash itself. Once again, it's the last line of the method. I don't need to set this variable anymore. The variable's being set up here on 138, and then we could return found player points. After that refactor, this is why tests are cool, right? It still says 5 examples, 1 failure. I might have broken something there. I might have left a variable hanging. Perhaps like I wrote something wrong like this. This would tell me now, right? We go back to 4 examples. It would say undefined local variable or method search name. Give me a little reminder of something I need to fix. So then we're back into shoe size. And here's the advantage with shoe size, now that we've actually broken into single responsibility, and where I'd kind of like to close off on the scope of this particular lecture. When it's time to write shoe size, what's the goal of shoe size? It looks like shoe size is taking in a player's name, and it's trying to get that specific player's shoe size. It's happening on Hashketball spec line 46. Yeah, it wants to take in a player name and then return that player's specific shoe size. Well, shoe size is stored on our game hash as the key shoe. So if Jeff Adrian is supposed to return 18, that's because Jeff Adrian's shoe key is 18. Shoe size is going to take in a player name, and it's supposed to return the player's shoe size. So we could say input, string of player name, output. Also a Ruby style thing, you should always have a space between your comment and your comment, like your comment tag versus the comment itself. Output should be an integer for player's shoe size. If we look at the steps of shoe size in here, we're going to need to get a list of players. We're going to need to find the player with the matching name. Seems kind of familiar, doesn't it? We talked about the single responsibility principle in terms of one method having one job to do and breaking up our methods until that's true. The other principle here is dry, right? It's don't repeat yourself. So I noticed myself repeating myself here, getting a list of players, finding a player with a matching name. I don't think I need to redo these steps, because those are the steps that we had up here, right? Inside of our num points scored. We had to get our list of players here, and then we delegated that to get players, and then we delegated to find player, to find the player with the matching name. So we can actually move this down here. We need to get players, and then find. Let me actually try this. See how close this is. Shoe size. Let's bring this in here. Get the list of players. We could still say players equals get players. To find a player with the matching name, we can still use that array in the searched for name. And then what's going to need to change here at the end of the method? I think we're just going to go from points to shoe, right? Let's bring this back. Found player shoe. See how that runs. That's a cool feeling, right? Because sometimes it takes you a lot of work to get one method running, but then you realize that that is also 80% of the work that you needed to do for the next method. So it's always important to be willing to break down the steps into smaller and smaller steps until you're even like in the docs, like how does select work? How does find work? How does map work? Let me slow down and really understand how that works on some sample piece of data. Then I can maybe put the Legos back together and build the right thing for my project using the right enumerable for the right job. So each is really naive. It just does something to each thing and then returns the array that we had. Map is an array builder, right? It's always got an output array, and then for each thing in the input array, it's going to return some sort of value that ends up at the output. And select is a filter. It only puts the element in the output array if some condition is matched. And find and select are siblings, basically. Find just finds the first record that matches. Select will find all of the records that match. Those are the enumerables that I wanted to kind of review today. And I'm glad that we also got a chance to play with some of the code ourselves and also think about some strategies around design and testing philosophies. I'm wondering at this point what questions people have. Sure. So the player stats is. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense to me. If I'm going through this lab, I think by the time I get to the player stats method, I will refactor the rest of my code to just pulling everything off of player stats. And I think that's the invitation that the code leaves you, to go back and refactor after you've touched this part. Because I think that once you've figured out the player stats thing, you're right. You're returning the hash that's going to give you the most kind of easy interface to access all of a player's information in one spot. So because I'm running through these tests one at a time, I hadn't arrived at player stats yet. So for the purpose of the scope of this lecture, I was doing the best refactoring for what's in front of me. Later on down the road, it's going to be on me to recognize where I'm repeating myself when I actually implement player stats, and then ask, would it be just better to use player stats as my way into an individual player, as opposed to doing my standalone methods that I created. But yeah, your approach is solid for sure. Other questions? Cool. So when we end a lecture here at Flatiron School, in the immersive program, people are supposed to clap because public speaking is difficult, and then everybody always has a chance to do it at some point. While you're here, you're going to be like writing and presenting blogs, you're going to be showing off projects that you've made, so we're always going to celebrate each other. But in terms of like clapping, that's wildly inappropriate on a Zoom, like, and everybody's unmuted and making loud sounds that can like feedback through. So instead, if everybody could just throw a bang bang in the Slack to show appreciation for my piece of this, which is admittedly the smaller piece. What's coming up next is making sure that this is not just information for you, but knowledge. And knowledge is just information plus experience. So now it's time for us to start diving into some code for the afternoon. I'm going to break us up into some groups, and I will announce those groups on the Slack in the next 5 minutes. What I'm going to do is open up a Zoom call for people to hop back on in the next let's say by 3:40, let's have everybody back on the Zoom. I know that people might be on sooner than that, but people might have other stuff to do to take care of their biology after a long lecture sit. But for the afternoon, we're going to be working on deploying on day one in small groups. It's going to involve a lot of conversation, learning things about each other as humans, but also talking through the finer points of Git. One of you in each group is going to be doing a little bit more with GitHub setup. That doesn't mean that you're going to be working on that solo. I fully expect that everybody's going to be working with the whole group, whether their task is to prepare the project at the beginning or to just submit something to the project when it's been prepared. I think that everybody's going to benefit from being actively in the process. So yeah, I'll hop back on this Zoom in a little bit. I'm going to upload this lecture to YouTube and assign groups and stuff, and I'll see you back in a little bit. Cheers. Bang, bang. May you find your next error very soon.